So I'm going to be moderating this panel today. And the key thing we wanted to do is really hear from, a customer in production. So we're happy to have Brandon here from Autodesk, and Isaac, and Rosalind. We're going to try to add a little bit of context to some of the things that get talked about today. Autodesk is interesting to me mainly because that's how I personally got into tech. So in 10th grade, I was in a computer club after school program. And the first thing we learned was AutoCAD. And I did a design competition at the state level in Georgia. And I think I came into second place mainly because I couldn't print the actual diagram. So I gladly took second place and decided that tech was for me. So I appreciate all the folks over at Autodesk that have worked on AutoCAD. It was definitely my entry point into tech. But today we really want to talk about, when we talk about CI/CD, there's so many ideas about, you should be deploying 2 trillion deploys per hour. It gets kind of overwhelming to think about the way people use this stuff, but we want to hear what the reality is. So I guess, Brandon, if you could give us a little bit about, we want to start with, we have Isaac and Rosalind here from Armory, and, they're one of the powerhouses behind open source Spinnaker. Tell us a little bit about like what life was like before really kind of getting something like Spinnaker, this conscious, deliberate effort to standardize, and what do things look like after?
Sure, absolutely. So first I'll take a step back and talk about a little bit larger context about what we're trying to achieve at Autodesk and the transformation we're undergoing. Autodesk is currently in the transformation from a kind of a desktop software company to a platform data company. And we have amazing products that are used across design and make for spaces for architecture, manufacturing, media and entertainment, and construction. But really what our customers want is data interoperability between these products and integration with third-party tools. In order to build this, we're undergoing a transformation to focus on building common platform components and services. And also maintaining high levels of customer trust is needed to be entrusted with customer data and be empowering the workflows that run these companies' businesses, or customers' businesses. So with all that context in mind, foundational to all that is having a common cloud infrastructure management CD platform, to manage the deployment of all these services with a common data developer experience. But if you look at where we're coming from, right? There were many different cloud infrastructure and CD tools and processes, right? So this represented a large scale duplication of work. We didn't really have the leverage to make a change in one place or add a capability in one place, and all services at Autodesk get that. So consolidating around Spinnaker really allows us to start consolidating all these tools and offer a unified developer experience. We have a very diverse tech stack at Autodesk, right? We have everything from Windows VMs to Lambdas. We have it all. Right, and Spinnaker provides a really elegant abstraction between the deployment logic and the underlying reference runtime. So this allows us to provide a unified developer experience across all these technologies. And also, also all the major cloud providers are also developing for Spinnaker, and this has been very powerful for us. So we have a strong relationship with AWS. And being able to go to them and working with Armory and be able to say, hey, we want to expand Lambda support on Spinnaker, and then being able to do that and making it a first-class deployment target in Spinnaker alongside containers and VMs has been really powerful for us.
I guess, Isaac, how is this inevitable? Does every company just end up in a world where, different teams go off and do their own thing, get something working, maybe adopt their own tools and automation and their own platforms, and then eventually people try to rein it all back again? Is that something common you see across companies, whether big or small, like Autodesk?
Yeah, I think the size of the company is absolutely a factor in terms of that happening, right? So typically when you look at smaller companies and organizations that have, let's just say 20 or 30 devs, they're probably standardizing on something like Kubernetes or maybe Kubernetes and Lambda, right? It's fairly homogeneous workload, but as you start to grow, it is inevitable because you look at these enterprises and you look at a company like Autodesk, they've acquired other companies. They've grown, and inevitably what happens is you end up with this disparate tool set and tool chain. And so we see that really quite frequently. And then of course, then we also see like, okay, let's try to standardize as much as we can. But I disagree with the idea of standardizing the entire organization. You will always have teams that are doing something unique or maybe on the forefront or trying to do something innovative. If you try to put them into the standardized bucket, they may not be able to achieve their goals, right? And this, you can see this with a whole set of new infrastructure and tools that people use to innovate that they didn't have before. And typically that's how it happens. So you want to have, a majority of them standardized, but you want to leave room for people to kind of get off the beaten path and innovate.
Yeah, I'm gonna kick it over to Rosalind before we get back to Brandon here, is that I know Rosalind did a lot of work with the community, not of just the practitioners, the people building the stuff, but also the customers. And this friction was kind of core to that, right? You even see this inside of Spinnaker itself, the features people want, everyone wants to do things slightly different way. How do companies and people should deal with that as they kind of listen to this today?
How should they deal with it? I mean, I think Isaac said something really key, and that is, I heard him say they may not be able to achieve their goals if you try to lock them down. And I really think the key, I think the way you start these conversations is the most important part, setting the tone of assessing because you say the word customer. So when I work for a DevOps company, my customer is a customer like Autodesk, but Brandon has a lot of internal customers, and they're all different personas. They may be at different points in the game, like Isaac is talking about. And so I think really starting from that perspective with your internal customers, understanding what's your goal? Because Brandon knows what his goal is, right? He probably knows what his organizational goal is in terms of that digital transformation. But I think asking about other people's goals as part of the front door of your process, and then really taking the time to listen and understand, can really go a long way to helping you navigate difficulty, proposing solutions that can be easily agreed upon because they're a win-win, and helping you figure out, you say serializing culture, Kelsey. I think that helps you serialize the culture a lot faster because you understand the why behind it, and you can recognize those patterns more quickly because you've been listening to the goals and motivations. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And I remember when we were kind of doing the pre-work for this session, when we talk about CD, especially the CD component, right? You want to continuously deliver this stuff. There's always some workflow that's underneath this. And I think, Brandon, you talked a lot about like, look, everyone's like business value, digital transformation, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's cool. But at the end of the day, you have to automate something and make something repeatable. What are those technical challenges? And also, I think there was kind of this undertone that, look, Google, Facebook, Apple, a lot of these companies are doing pretty great. But for companies that are not those, what are the actual technical challenges that Autodesk is specifically facing?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that we came across at Autodesk was, it's one thing to automate the deployment of a service, but then there's a lot of meta infrastructure around a service that we actually had to manage. So these are things like AWS accounts, IAM permissions, and we started to think about how can we fully automate the manage of kind of this meta infrastructure that's really not managed by Spinnaker or any of these CD platforms. So that was a challenge that we came across. We went with a more segmented account architecture where we have an account per service, per region, per environment. So now when we create a new service or we launch a new service into a new region, we don't just have to think about, we need to deploy that service in that region. We also need to manage the networking and the kind of the account and IAM and authorization for that service.
Brandon, I'm going to double click on that because if people are listening to this, they're going to be like, what?
Yeah.
One account per service? Ooh.
Yeah.
Right? That's hard to manage, period. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure there's a reason why, right? Because I think in some people's mind, there is a best practice to do everything in the world.
Yeah.
But you've chosen this approach. Maybe give a little context of why this approach works best for Autodesk. And also maybe give us a little color about what a service is. Are we talking, all the applications that make up a endpoint, or are you talking about individual, binaries or containers?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to the last part is that we have some variability there, right? So people might have multiple components that they call a service, but we skew towards it being more segmented, right? And that is really kind of related to how we set up authorization for access to those things based on the account. So yeah, so some of the reasons that we did it is, we've had problems with large multi-tenant accounts hitting AWS API rate limits where, where they start to affect each other. There's also some complexities related to AWS billing when you start going multi-region where, the AWS pair might be different. And it also simplifies this automation. If you think about, if you know what the account coordinates based on a service's region, its environment, et cetera, then it's easier to automate. We actually worked with AWS. So we have a service that we built in-house that kind of works as a service registry, and it also creates accounts and does all the associated networking. And we actually worked with AWS and Armory last year to build dynamic account registration into Spinnaker to help us kind of automate some of this complexity. Yeah.
One thing I hope that people are listening, like this key takeaway, you kind of defined how you wanted to work first, right? Like you decided what was best for Autodesk. We need to work this way. It sounds like you did a little bit of learning. You probably did the put everything in one account approach, revisited that, changed it around, and then landed on something that just made sense for the business, for the security policies. And then you took that and said, okay, let's make our CD tool do that versus the other way around, where I think some people will start with the CD tool and try to have its UI guide the way they work. Isaac, is that the best way to approach, this particular way of using something like Spinnaker and Armory services?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that I get asked every time I walk into a customer site is, Isaac, please tell me the best practices for CD. Please tell me the best practices. And I think, Kelsey, you know this, I've heard you say this, is like, there really are no such thing as CD like best practices. It's really like, what's good for your organization? What do you need? Because I can tell you what's good for Brandon and Autodesk is not the same that the same needs of perhaps a bank that has a financial institution that has different security needs and has different requirements, right? So absolutely, starting from, and actually Rosalind was saying this too, starting from your goals. What does your teams need? And then in your business, what does your business need? And I think this is something that's really, really important because so many times I can give you feedback, but it just will not fit into the things that you're doing because it's so specific and context specific to the way that you need to deliver your software. So absolutely, I actually love the way that Brandon and Autodesk did this because that's just something kind of like out of the box thinking of like, hey, we're going to create an account for every single service. And it sounds crazy at first, but if it meets your requirements, like what actually is crazy about it in reality, right? There's really nothing if you step back. I'd love to know, Brandon, like how difficult was it to actually get that through to the rest of the organization? Like, that sounds crazy. Was it crazy to the teams or did they just kind of jump onto it because they knew that it was the right thing to do?
Well, one of the things that we paired with the rest of the organization actually wrote a strategy paper around this. So we involved a lot of different organizations across Autodesk to be able to think through this problem. We allowed for some variability, so, this is not an account per container, right? So we allowed for some variability there. And then we also like checked in with AWS, said, hey, what is the best practice that you're seeing people do this at scale? And they definitely verified with us that you're headed down the right path of having a more segmented account architecture. So, kind of, it wasn't something that we just came to overnight, right? It was something that we worked with the rest of the organization, multiple organizations within Autodesk, and all came together and drove to the same place with AWS. Yeah.
Yeah, Ross, you talk about business goals a lot, and I think some people kind of conflate this, right? In this case, what I'm hearing what Brandon talks about is like, this is the plan to execute and deliver the software that we're building. And of course, hopefully that software is being built to tackle business goals, right? Sometimes people will say, well, what Brandon's talking about are not the business goals, right? What Brandon's talking about is too low level and no one should think about it or worry about it. They should focus on, selling more Autodesk software. How do you kind of tease those two things out? Because they're both need attention and they both need detailed plans.
Yeah. And actually what you're talking about, Kelsey, is the most computationally expensive work that the human brain can do. And this is it's actually a mystery of science. There is no working mathematical model of how human brains do this quickly. We do not understand how we take a bunch of different motivations that we're inferring through communication, and they're all weighted. They all have different weights, and that we have to make inferences on the weights too. And then we have to decide what to do or decide what to say and how to communicate. So I think it's a $1 billion question that you're asking. But I think there are some strategies to fall back on, and it really does start with getting that context and thinking about the difference. I think kind of what you're pointing to is the difference between individual motivations and then what are your joint goals. Ideally, your company has really clearly outlined joint goals, joint intentions for what you want to do for the business, and those are attached to what your stakeholders want, et cetera. But then below that, there's all kinds of possible motivations that individuals can have. They could be looking for recognition. They may really want to have influence at the company and make their mark. That could be important to them. They could really want to smooth the way and make things easier for them because their brain is like in a lazy place and they want to do less work. That's very human. They may have some shame around some skills that they think that they don't have, or the amount of time it takes them to do something, and they don't want that to be exposed. There's the whole American value of independence that I think is still really prevalent in our culture, that folks feel like they have to solve problems themselves, and that's very prevalent in our space. Also, some folks really want to do things themselves because they want to develop the skills to do it, and people are really motivated by that. And there's that fear of being left behind that comes up too, right? So we have our basal ganglia. Those are responsible for all of our automatic behavior and keeping the homeostasis that we get from our routines. Part of those basal ganglia are our amygdala, which is responsible for protecting us, keeping us safe. And that actually interprets change as a threat. So when that amygdala gets activated by a change, then that can really create a lot of pushback. So I think it's worth it to take the time to double click when you're talking with people one-on-one about, so Brandon's saying, hey, I really need you to adopt this pattern. It's really great to start that conversation by trying to suss out, it's a little touchy-feely, but trying to figure out how's the person feeling about this problem that they're trying to solve. Maybe have they had any bad experiences with doing this type of thing in the past? And where's their head at? Understanding that, and then really clearly also give you an opportunity to clearly state what your goal is, right? Because so you're asking someone about their goal, you're getting that, you're really listening, and you're keeping track of that. And then maybe they, at the same time, the other person might be trying to understand what your goal is, right? So, and that's really expensive for their brain to do. So just tell them, hey, what I'm trying to do right here is trying to make sure that we can effectively implement our security policies, because down the line, you don't want to have XYZ happen, right? So kind of staying focused on your goals, but starting that conversation with their goals, I think is the best way to help people see that separation.
And I think that maps really well to the consensus building that Brandon laid out. This fact that you go and put this in a doc and say, hey, here's the strategy we want. We've talked to AWS. They gave us guidance. We've worked with the Spinnaker team over at Armory. They gave us the integration work that we needed inside of the tool itself. This is what we're going to roll out. And my guess, Brandon, and maybe add a little detail here, when you go out and you build consensus with the rest of the organization about this plan, how much feedback goes into that doc? And then how much does it change over time? And does it live on as a living doc?
It definitely does go on to a living doc. And I really like what Rosalind said, because, and this is maybe something that I learned in the last year pretty heavily, is that, you have, when implementing CD and changes like this in an organization is not, it's also people and process problem, right? And it's not as only a technology problem. And, when we originally came out, we started focusing on one group of persona of customer that wanted a higher level abstraction, right? And maybe didn't care about some of these things that we're talking about necessarily. They were like, just let me feed you my requirements and I don't care about any of the details. But then as we started to expand our scope and started to talk to more of the organization, what we realized is that there's a large variety of ownership models across Autodesk. There were some teams that had implemented end-to-end service ownership with their software engineers, and they didn't really care about pipelines or Terraform or anything like that. Then other organizations had large established DevOps teams that had their own opinions about these things. So what that led us to do is kind of take a step back, building kind of what Isaac and Rosalind said, is saying, we're going to meet these teams where we're at, and we're building a platform that people can build upon. If you want that higher level abstraction, and maybe you're not interested in the details, right, that we've been talking about, like account segmentation and stuff like that, then there's a place for you there. But if you also then thinking about Spinnaker and the other infrastructure things that we do is more of a modular platform that we offer these APIs to other teams to build upon and use as they see fit, and pushing the standards and the value deeper into the platform, right? And that's something that's really been good for us. And they are very much living ideas then, right? Because it's fundamentally a shift from thinking like, okay, I'm an internal team, I have a product and I have a customer, right? From saying that I'm building a platform and I have partners, right? The partners are coming and helping, building on top of the platform. So it is definitely, all these things are living documents and a constant conversation.
You also kind of talked about a little bit of this pattern I see with customers, this emergence of the platform team.
Yep.
Right. I think there's this idea, and it reminds me a lot of the way people used to have like the QA team and the build team. Like you had a person solely responsible for figuring out how builds are done. Hey, pencils down. It's Thursday. I'm going to tag a release in CVS. Some people may remember that. It's way before GitHub. And so you kind of pushed all this responsibility there. But I think what you kind of describe now is like, look, if you're a platform team and you're going in this direction, I think Ross talked about this as well, you're dealing with a lot of responsibility in terms of like creating these golden paths, learning that there will probably be no golden path. And you're going to have to build something a little bit more extensible, something that actually captures feedback and allows maybe people beyond the platform team to actually help extend and build the platform. Is that the kind of direction that Autodesk has? Does Autodesk have a centralized platform team that is owning this area?
Yeah, we definitely, so if we talk about the Spinnaker piece, the CD piece that we're talking about today, we group a couple technologies of that together. We have some Terraform that we run that's also does some infrastructure stuff for us. And we actually kind of run this as an inner source project. So we have, people came to us and said, hey, we like what you're building, but we want X, Y, and Z, and they're different from what you have. And, I'm looking at your roadmap. Well, you know what? Your roadmap doesn't fit what I need. That's okay. You know what? I'm going to go build my own. And so what that had us do is take a step back and say, hold on, how can we give all of these partners from across the organizations a seat at the table to actually bring their resources and help build on top of the platform what they need, right? So that we're all building and contributing together. So that's exactly the kind of the pivot that we've taken recently, is that we're now having multiple organizations come together and they have a say in what and how the platform is built, what gets, and they vote with their resources, right? If they want to come and actually contribute something and add something, then they can do that.
I like that word, partners. Isaac, you've seen a lot of customers out there. I mean, if you had to think about maybe one or two ways where, think about the people listening here, right? They're hearing Autodesk's story. They're probably learning a few things from that. Given your field view, how should companies really think about starting out with maybe this nucleus of folks who will own this and maybe try to grow it across the business? Should they start that innovation cloud team for the third time? Or is there a different way they should think about this?
Yeah, well, I think, we've said this a few times. I'm just going to reiterate because I think it's so important, which is having very clearly stated goals that you have people aligned around. One of the things that I can tell going into an organization is if I talk to 3 or 4 different people and they respond back to me that with 3 or 4 different goals onto why we're moving on to Kubernetes, man, I could tell you it's going to be a long haul getting everybody aligned, and it's going to be 2-3 years before you get 1 or 2 services on there. And those are real numbers. Like I've seen 2 services take 2 years, because the reason why, and Roz was talking about this, why. Oh, by the way, Roz, that was elegant, going from the psychology and the brain to back to the technology. That was an elegant transition. I like that. I can tell that other people like that too. And I think
it matters. It's all there.
It really does. And I think that the why, and getting people to understand the why, is much harder than I think engineering leadership understands what it's going to really take to get people to understand the why and to cross over from being afraid of change to accepting the change and moving with the change. Now, from there, I do think, I personally don't ever love the idea of like innovation only happens on these teams, but I do think you need to start somewhere. And starting small is a great place to kind of have people, put their guards down a little bit and just go, listen, we're going on this journey, and we're starting here. This is the beginning of the journey. And starting from the very beginning, Brandon, I like where you're at right now with the idea of like, hey, actually, I can't lock everybody into just this one golden path, because I understand you have to go in understanding that everybody's going to be a little bit different, but you do have to start with somebody, right? You got to pick that team that you're going to kind of take to the cloud or whatever that change may be for you, and start working with those people. But when you get to that second customer, don't impose the requirements of that first customer on that second one, or don't impose your own idea of what you really think CD is, because that second customer might be different. So starting with the idea of extensibility, flexibility, empathy for your customer, I think is the most critical thing that you can do to have really more of an inclusive mindset, versus starting with, I am Isaac, I know the way, I know the right way to do CD, your way is the wrong way, this will never work. And I've seen those two different mentalities, and I love how Brandon's approaching this, and it's night and day. And I've seen this too, where teams go, well, I'm just going to mandate it to my other teams. And even if you have the power to mandate onto these other teams, what I've seen, and I can measure this with the data that we have, is that the adoption of your platform, even when it's mandated, is much slower than the teams that are not mandated and feel a sense of ownership on the project, or feel a sense of flexibility that they can do what they need. It's really interesting. The mandate I've almost never seen work. So if you're out there and you think, oh, I'm going to go to the top and we're going to have the VP or the SVP mandate something, it'll just go much, much slower than actually doing the work of listening to people, being empathetic and being flexible. And actually, it's more fun designing a platform where it's flexible and you can give people the ability to put components together from an engineering perspective. At least for me, that's more fun than just hard coding everything for the customers. It's a much more interesting programming problem.
Yeah, on the mandate front, the analogy I like to use here is, I have a daughter in high school, and when you mandate things, that's like the equivalent of going school shopping for your kids, but you don't let them come with you, and you just bring back what you think they like to wear, and you just see their faces like, Mom, I'm not into goth. What is this? And so it's one of those things where you want them to actually have a say in what they're buying. You might put some parameters around that, like a budget or something, but you definitely don't want to buy your kids' school clothes for them. We got to wrap up here. We got a couple of minutes left. And I think the biggest thing that we've learned a lot today, I think a lot of companies really don't understand the time horizon to get started and really start to see value. I think we're going to wrap with you, Brandon, here. When people are getting started, how long before they can really expect to see some value? And then how long before they get to really feel like they've really arrived, because you're never done? Maybe take us out with those 2 checkpoints: when you receive value and when you really feel like you've made that transition.
Yeah, I think that it's different for every organization, right? So I did a previous transformation at my previous company before Autodesk, and it was a much smaller company, and the value was able to be realized a lot quicker, just because there was a lot less people to get alignment with, and a lot less compliance controls and stuff like that to be able to implement before you can get to actually seeing value. But
are we talking 30 days or 30 years?
Well, I would say, you know, order of like 6 months, right, to really start getting things in place to where you can start seeing at least the light at the end of the tunnel and seeing a clear path of what you're doing. I think that also, though, you know, spending the time like we did around the account strategy and doing things up front and trying to think about some of the hard problems up front is also, you know, that takes time and that pushes out the horizon of when you're going to be able to get value immediately. But definitely is worthwhile. Yeah. And then, I mean, obviously it's never done, right? And I think that one cool thing that we're taking out of this conversation is this idea of building with partners, right? And not trying to have this golden path that you force everybody into is really going to accelerate the timeline that you get to having value for your organization, because you're going to have a bunch of people come build with you, right? Rather than you know, kind of like talking to people and trying to reason about what is the golden path. You know, offering a path with guardrails, but extensibility that people can build upon.
Awesome. I want to thank all the panelists. I know you all are on social media. We'll share our Twitter handles with different people after the session. I want to appreciate you again, Brandon, for coming on and sharing Autodesk's story. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tracy.